November of 1899, 6 men from Montegut, Louisiana, poled 3 pirogues into a closed bayou system south of Bayou du Large to trap fur for the winter season, and 2 of us came back. On the morning of the 4th day, we found that every trap on the eastern line, 31 sets across a quarter-mile of cypress brake, had been tripped, cleaned, rebaited, and reset during the night, and not one man in camp had left his bedroll. The spring tension on each trap had been adjusted to a weight no muskrat could have triggered, and the bait had been replaced with cuts of fresh nutria that were not from our provisions and had not come from any animal we had killed. My name is Augustin Landry. I am 81 years old, and I am dying in the same house in Montegut where my mother told me not to go, and I did not listen. And 4 men I knew by name are still in that basin because I did not listen. On the morning we left that basin, every pelt we had taken was stacked by species in the drying shed. Every piece of equipment was sorted and placed in the pirogues, and our provisions had been replenished with fresh meat, linsal we did not kill. Something had packed us out the way you pack out a crew whose season is finished. Pelletier looked at the pirogues and said 5 words I'm going to carry to my grave, and I will tell you what they were, but not before you understand what had been feeding us. I have trapped fur in the parishes of Terrebonne, La Fourche, and St. Mary since I was 14 years old, which means I have spent 67 years in water up to my chest. And in that time, I have pulled approximately 40,000 pelts from the bayous and marshes of southern Louisiana and sold them to every broker between Houma and New Orleans. I was not an educated man. I attended school through the 5th grade at the parish school in Montegut, where the instruction was in English and I spoke only French. And I left because my hands were more useful on a trap line than on a pencil, and that has been true for the duration of my life. I am not a man who tells stories for the pleasure of it. I am not a man who frightens easily. I have been charged by bull alligators in water too deep to stand in. I have been pinned under a capsized pirogue in a January current with water so cold it stopped my breath before I went under. I have set bones in my own hand with a cypress splint and rawhide and gone back to work the same afternoon. I say this not to impress anyone, but to establish that the things I'm about to describe were witnessed by a man whose living depended on accurate observation of the natural world, and who had learned, by the age of 30, to trust what he saw over what he wished to be true. My mother was Marie-Rose Landry, née Verdun, and she was 58 years old in the autumn of 1899, and she was the traiteur of Montegut and the surrounding settlements along the lower bayou. A traiteur, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a healer in the Cajun tradition, not a physician, not a witch, but a person who treats illness and injury through prayer, herbs, and a knowledge of the body that is passed from one practitioner to the next by hand and by voice. My mother had been treating the people of lower Terrebonne Parish since she was 19. She had set bones, delivered infants, drawn fever, and closed wounds that the nearest doctor, who was in Houma, roughly 20 miles north by water, could not have reached in time to treat. She was respected by every family in Montegut, and she was feared by some. And she had never once, in my experience, been wrong about the things she warned against. On the morning of November the 3rd, 1899, as I loaded my pirogue at the landing behind our house, my mother came out onto the porch and said that I should not go to the basin south of Bayou du Large. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain. She said, "Augustin, that basin gives too much. Do not go where the land gives too much." I told her I had been trapping for 16 years and had never had a season that gave too much. She looked at me for a long time, and she said nothing else. And I pushed off the landing, and I did not look back. And that is the decision I've been living inside for 51 years. The basin south of Bayou du Large had no official name on any map I've seen, though the older trappers in Montegut sometimes called it Le Fond, which means the bottom or the end. It was a closed system a network of bayous and cypress breaks, approximately 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. Fed by overflow from Bayou du Large during the spring rise and sealed off during the autumn low water by a series of mud levees that made the interior accessible only by pirogue, through a single narrow channel on the northern end. The cypress in the basin was old-growth trees I estimated at 300 years or more, with buttresses wider than a pirogue is long, and canopies so dense that at midday the light on the water was the color of weak tea. The floor was black mud and submerged root systems, and the water depth varied from 6 inches on the chenières to approximately 8 feet in the deeper channels. In 3 previous autumn seasons, 1896, 1897, and 1898, crews from Montegut had trapped the basin and returned with yields that were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Muskrat, nutria, otter, mink, and raccoon, in numbers that exceeded the best production of any comparable basin in Lower Terrebonne by a factor I would estimate at 3 to 1. No other crew worked the basin. I did not ask why. I should have asked why. On the morning of November the 4th, our party of 6 assembled at the northern channel mouth and entered the basin in 3 pirogues, 2 men to a boat. I will name them now because they were real men with real families, and I have carried their names for half a century, and I will not carry them alone any longer. The lead pirogue carried our crew chief, Henri Hébert, age 41, born in Montegut, a trapper of 23 years' experience who had led the 1897 crew into the same basin and come back with the largest haul Terrebonne Parish had recorded in a decade. He was a hard man, quiet in his opinions, and he did not tolerate speculation about things that could not be weighed or sold. Beside him was the youngest of us, Théodore Boudreau, age 19, from Chauvin. On his second season, a strong polar, but an uncertain trapper who had been brought along because Hébert owed his father a favor, and the boy needed the work. The second pirogue carried myself and the man I will be speaking of most in this account, Émile Pelletier, age 38, born in LeBlanc, a trapper and tracker of, in my judgment, extraordinary ability. Pelletier had spent 7 years guiding hunting parties in the Atchafalaya before returning to independent trapping in the lower parishes, and he possessed a quality I have not encountered in any other man before or since. He observed everything and interpreted nothing until he had observed it 3 times. He did not guess. He did not speculate. He watched, and he counted, and he compared. And when he spoke, it was because he had verified what he was about to say against what he had already seen. If I'm telling you this story, it is because Pelletier is not alive to tell it himself. He died in 1932. He was the better observer. I was the one who remembered. The third pirogue carried Jean-Pierre LeBlanc, age 35, from Montegut, the strongest man in the crew and the most productive trapper I have ever worked beside a runny when a man who could clear and reset a full line of 40 sets in 4 hours and pull pelts at a rate that made the rest of us look like we were working half days. And beside him, Alcide Thibodeau, age 44, from Cocodrie, a quiet, competent man who had trapped every basin in Lower Terrebonne over 20 years and who served as our camp builder and equipment man. By the afternoon of that first day, we had established camp on a chenière, a low, dry ridge of shell and sand, roughly 60 yards long and 20 wide, near the center of the basin, and had begun setting our first lines. The chenière sat approximately 2 feet above the waterline and supported a stand of live oaks and palmetto that provided adequate shelter and a platform for our drying shed, which Thibodeau constructed from cypress poles and canvas in under 3 hours. We had provisions for 18 days: rice, salt pork, coffee, cornmeal, and sugar, plus whatever game and fish we took from the basin. Our equipment included approximately 180 steel leg-hold traps of the Newhouse No. 1.5 pattern, 60 feet of chain, skinning knives, stretching boards, and 3 Winchester rifles, 1 per pirogue, for alligators and camp defense. By the evening of the second day, we had set 4 full lines, eastern, western, northern, and a short southern run, into a tupelo break that Pelletier had identified as a mink corridor. And the returns were already exceptional. I pulled 11 muskrat and 2 nutria from the eastern line, alone on the first morning check. Pelletier pulled 8 muskrat, 1 otter, and a mink from the western line. LeBlanc, working the northern line, pulled 19 muskrat and 3 nutria. Hebert said it was going to be the best season any of us had ever had. And Rougarou, who had never seen yields like this, laughed out loud in the pirogue. And I remember the sound of that laugh carrying across the flat water and coming back to us from the cypress a full second later, as if someone a quarter-mile away had repeated it. I did not think about that echo. I should have. Pelletier did not laugh. He was making marks on a piece of oilcloth he used as a trapline map, a hand-drawn chart of the basin showing our 4 lines, the cheniere, the channel mouth, and the deeper runs. On that first evening, I saw him marking small X's at locations along the lines where, he said, the game trails were too clean. I asked what he meant. He said the animal runs the paths muskrat and nutria used to move between water and feeding ground were unusually direct. In a normal basin, he said, runs curve and branch and double back because the animals are navigating root systems and competing for routes. In this basin, the runs were straight. He said they looked channeled. He said the animals were not traveling. They were arriving. I did not ask what he meant by that either. The yields were exceptional. We had work to do. On the evening of the third day, I counted our production. 61 pelts across all 4 lines in 48 hours of active trapping. LeBlanc alone had pulled 27. He was working at a rate I'd never seen from any trapper in any basin, and he was grinning when he came back to camp with his pirogues low in the water from the weight. And he said to Hebert that if the season kept on like this, he would have enough to pay off his house lot and still have money for lumber. That night, I lay in my bedroll on the cheniere and listened to the basin, and I heard nothing wrong. The frogs were calling. The insects were steady. An owl was working somewhere to the south. The water moved against the cypress knees with the small rhythmic sounds I had heard every autumn of my working life. There was nothing absent. There was nothing silent. If anything, the basin was louder than it should have been, more active, more alive, more populated than any closed system I had worked in late November, when the cold should have been suppressing insect activity and thinning the frog chorus. The sound was not wrong. The sound was too much, too full. I did not think about that either. On the morning of November the 7th, the 4th day in the basin, I woke before dawn to check the eastern line and heard my own name spoken clearly from a distance I estimated at 300 yards, in a direction I knew to be open water with no land and no man standing on it. The voice was Hebert's. He was lying in his bedroll 6 feet from me. He had not spoken. I sat up and listened. The basin was still dark. The canopy blocked what little moonlight there was, and the air was approximately 50 degrees and damp, with a ground fog sitting on the water at roughly 2 feet. From the direction of the eastern line, I heard Hebert's voice again, clearly, as if he were standing beside me, saying, "We'll run the eastern line first and check the tupelo sets on the way back." These were the exact words Hebert had said the previous evening, at the fire, while we were discussing the next morning's route. I had heard him say them. Now I was hearing them again, from the wrong direction, at the wrong time, in a voice that carried with a clarity no human voice should have possessed across 300 yards of cypress and open water. Rougarou was awake. He was sitting upright in his bedroll with his hands flat on the ground beside him, as if he were about to stand. And he was looking in the same direction I was looking, southeast, toward the eastern line. He said, "Did you hear that?" I said I heard it. He said, "That was Hebert." I said I knew. We both looked at Hebert, who was asleep, breathing steadily, and had not moved. There are things about sound in a swamp that can deceive a man. Water reflects sound. Cypress canopy can create acoustic channels that carry a voice further than open air. Temperature inversions. Warm air above cold water can bend sound waves and make a man seem closer or further than he is. I have heard my own voice come back to me from a tree line a quarter-mile away, and I have heard other men's voices arrive from directions that did not match where they were standing. These are known effects. I had experienced them many times. I told Rougarou it was an echo, a delayed reflection of Hébert's words from the previous evening, somehow stored and released by the acoustic properties of the basin. I did not believe this. The physics of it were wrong. Sound does not store. Sound does not replay 12 hours after it is produced. But it was the only explanation available that did not require me to consider alternatives I was not prepared to consider. And Rougarou accepted it because he was 19 and wanted to accept it. And we went to check the eastern line. It was on the eastern line that we found the traps. 31 sets. Every one tripped. Every one cleaned, the jaws wiped of fur and blood. Every one rebaited with fresh cuts of nutria meat that had been sliced, not torn, with an edge I estimated was sharper than any knife in our camp. Every one reset, with the pan tension adjusted to approximately twice the standard setting too heavy for a muskrat, appropriate for a nutria or a small otter. Every one operational. I will not describe in full what I felt when I knelt beside the first reset trap and saw the bait cut. I will say that my hands were steady and my breathing was controlled, and that I checked every subsequent trap with the professional attention I had trained myself to bring to my equipment, and that by the 15th trap I had stopped looking for a natural explanation because there was not one. Pelletier arrived on the eastern line approximately 40 minutes after Rougarou and I had begun our inspection. He came alone in his pirogue, moving slowly, and he did not speak when he pulled alongside us. He stepped out into the water. It was approximately knee-deep on the eastern shelf, and he walked to the nearest reset trap, and he knelt beside it, and he examined it for what I estimate was 4 full minutes without touching it. He checked the spring tension with his thumb. He examined the bait cut. He looked at the mud around the trap base for prints. He stood up and walked to the next trap and did the same thing. He did this for 6 traps. Pelletier, who had spent 7 years guiding in the Atchafalaya and 20 years trapping every water system in lower Terrebonne, said, "This was done by hands." He said, "The spring compression is set to a specific target weight, and it is consistent across every trap I've checked." He said, "Whatever did this understands how the mechanism works, and it has set these traps to catch something larger than what we were catching." Rougarou asked if a man could have done it if someone from another crew might have entered the basin at night. Pelletier pointed at the mud around the trap base. There were no boot prints. There were no pirogue drag marks. There were impressions in the mud that Pelletier studied for a long time and did not describe to Rougarou. He described them to me later, privately. They were long. They were deep. They were not the prints of any animal he had catalogued in 20 years of tracking in southern Louisiana. He said they were approximately 14 inches from heel to toe, and the toe impressions suggested a foot with 4 digits, not 5, and the weight distribution indicated something that walked upright. On the morning we returned to camp with this information, Hébert listened, asked how many pelts the reset traps had caught, and when I told him the answer was 7 nutria and 2 otters larger animals than our original sets would have taken, he said, "Then they're working." He did not ask who had set them. He did not ask how. He said, "Check them again tonight and report what you find." That was all. I thought of my mother that afternoon, sitting on the cheniere while Thibodeau stretched pelts in the drying shed and LeBlanc organized the next day's line rotation. I thought of her standing on the porch in Montegut with her hands at her sides and her face still. I thought of the single word she had said to me 3 days before I left, when I told her I was going back to the basin for a 3rd consecutive season. She did not say, "Do not go." She had already said that, and I had already refused. She said one word. She said, "Écoute." Listen. I had not listened. I was listening now. On the night of November the 7th, I slept poorly and woke twice, once at what I estimate was 2 in the morning, and again at approximately 4. Both times I lay still and listened to the basin. The frogs were calling. The insects were active. The water moved against the cypress knees. There was nothing wrong with the sound. There was nothing absent. But on the second waking, I heard something I could not place, a low, sustained vibration that was not a sound so much as a pressure, a heaviness in the air that I felt in my sternum before I heard it in my ears. It lasted approximately 10 seconds. Then it stopped. The frogs continued without interruption. Whatever had produced the vibration was either part of the basin's normal activity or was so familiar to the basin's animal population that it did not register as a threat. On the morning of November the 8th, the 5th day, Pelletier and I ran the western line together. The yields were, again, extraordinary. 14 muskrat, 3 nutria, 1 otter. Pelletier skinned and stretched as we worked, saying little, but I noticed that he was adding to his oilcloth map more X marks, more annotations, and a shorthand I could not read. At one point he stopped poling and held the pirogue still with his push-pole braced against a cypress knee, and he looked at the water for approximately 30 seconds, and he said, "The current is wrong." I asked what he meant. He said that in a closed basin with no active inflow, and the autumn low water had sealed the northern channel to a depth of approximately 4 inches. Barely enough for a loaded pirogue, there should be no meaningful current. Standing water moves only by wind, temperature differentials, or displacement. There was no wind. The temperature was stable, but the water in the western channel was moving slowly, perhaps a quarter knot from south to north. Something in the southern end of the basin was displacing water, something large enough to create a detectable current across a distance Pelletier estimated at half a mile. He made a note on his map. He did not speculate. By the afternoon of the 8th, LeBlanc's cumulative production had reached 44 pelts, more than twice my own count, and roughly a third of the entire crew's total output. He was working longer hours than anyone, checking his lines before dawn and again at dusk. And the northern line was producing at a rate that Pelletier said was biologically unreasonable. He meant that the number of animals being caught suggested a population density that should not exist in a closed basin of this size. Either the animals were being replenished from an external source, which was impossible, given the sealed channel, or they were being concentrated, driven, funneled toward the trap lines from elsewhere in the basin. Pelletier marked more X's on his map. On the night of November the 8th, I heard the vibration again, longer this time, perhaps 20 seconds, and from a direction I estimated as south-southwest, deeper in the basin. Thibodeau heard it too. He sat up in his bedroll and said it sounded like a bull alligator's bellow heard through water, which was a reasonable comparison, except that the frequency was too low and the duration too sustained, and the season was wrong. Bull alligators bellow in spring, during mating, not in late November. Hebert said it was a log settling in deep mud. Pelletier, who was awake and sitting with his back against a live oak, said nothing. On the morning of November the 9th, the 6th day, I found the evidence that made the rest of this account inevitable. I was checking the short southern line in the Tupelo break, alone, approximately 400 yards from camp. The Tupelo break was a dense stand of water tupelo growing in roughly 3 feet of standing water, with a canopy so tight that the light was green-brown even at midday, and the air smelled of tannin and decomposing leaves and something else, a deep, organic smell I could not identify, heavier than rot, sweeter than musk, that seemed to intensify the deeper I poled into the break. At the 7th trap on the southern line, I found that the trap had been moved, not sprung, not tripped, moved. The trap had been pulled from its original set position, staked to a submerged root at the waterline, and relocated approximately 8 feet further into the break, to a position beside a tupelo knee, where a fresh animal run was clearly visible in the mud. The run had not been there when I set the trap 2 days prior. I was certain of this. The trap had been restaked to a new route, reset with the same elevated pan tension I had seen on the eastern line, and rebaited with a fresh cut of nutria. It had caught a large male mink, the first mink on the southern line, worth approximately $4 at current Huma prices. The stake had been driven into the submerged root with a force I could not replicate by hand. I tried. I braced my feet against the tupelo knee and pulled on the stake with both hands, and it did not move. It had been driven approximately 6 inches into a green cypress root, underwater, by something with the grip strength to sink hardened steel into living wood. I did not move the trap. I did not reset it. I marked its new position on my own rough map, and I returned to camp, and I told Pelletier what I had found, and Pelletier came back with me that afternoon and examined the relocation himself. He measured the depth of the stake penetration with a marked stick. He examined the fresh animal run. He looked at the mud around the new trap position, and he found the same long, deep, 4-toed impressions he had found on the eastern line. Pelletier, who did not guess, who did not speculate, who verified everything 3 times before he spoke, said, "It moved our trap to a better position." He said, "It drove game to the new position before it moved the trap." He said, "It is managing our trap lines." I have thought about those words for 51 years, and I will not tell you they did not frighten me, because they did. But what frightened me more was the thing Pelletier said next. Quietly, louder, standing in 3 feet of black water in the tupelo break with his push-pole in one hand and his Winchester in the other. He said, "Your mother said the good years are the dangerous ones. I think the good years are the bait." He was right. We did not leave. We should have left. The yields were the best any of us had ever seen. We had work to do. On the evening of November the 9th, Pelletier went out alone to check the western line at dusk. He was gone for approximately 90 minutes. When he returned to camp, he did not pull his pirogue up onto the cheniere. He sat in the boat in the shallows at the edge of camp with his rifle across his knees, and he stared at the water. And he did not speak for what I estimate was 20 minutes. Thibodeau offered him coffee. He did not respond. Boudreau asked if the line had produced. He did not respond. I walked to the water's edge and crouched beside his pirogue, and I said his name. He looked at me. His face was not frightened. His face was the face of a man who had just seen something that reorganized everything he understood about where he was and what he was doing in it. He said, "I saw it. At the western line, approximately 300 yards from camp, in the last gray light before full dark, Pelletier had seen the creature. He was checking the 9th trap on the western run, a set positioned at the base of a large cypress on a shallow shelf where muskrat trails converged when he saw movement in the water, approximately 60 yards further down the channel. He stopped poling and held the pirogue still. The movement was large, not a ripple, a displacement. Water pushed aside by something moving through it at roughly waist depth. Moving slowly, moving deliberately, moving toward the trap line. Pelletier raised his rifle and sighted through the rear notch and watched through the iron sights because they were steadier than his hands. The thing that came out of the deeper water and onto the shelf was not an alligator. It was not a bear. It was not a man. Pelletier, who had tracked every animal that lives in southern Louisiana and had guided hunters to black bear, cougar, and bull alligators longer than a pirogue, said that what he saw stood upright on 2 legs in approximately 2 feet of water, and that it was tall. He estimated 7 feet from the waterline to the top of its head, which would place its full standing height at something over 8 feet, and that its body was covered in dark hair or fur that was matted with mud and draped with Spanish moss in a way that made it nearly indistinguishable from the cypress trunks around it, and that its arms were long and its shoulders were heavy, and its head was wrong. He said the head was wrong. He said it was shaped like a dog's skull elongated, with a pronounced jaw and a muzzle that extended forward from the face in a way that no human skull does, and no primate skull does, and no bear skull does. He said the ears were high and pointed. He said the eyes caught what little light remained and reflected it back with a yellow-amber luminescence that he had seen in alligators and in dogs and in nothing that stood on two legs. The creature walked to the trap line. It walked upright, in water, with a gait Pelletier described as deliberate and unhurried. It reached the nearest set, the seventh trap on the western line, and it knelt. It knelt in the water the way a man kneels, on both knees, with its back straight. It reached into the water with both hands, and it pulled a muskrat from the underbrush. A live muskrat, not trapped, not injured, and it held the animal in one hand, and with the other hand, it opened the trap jaws, positioned the muskrat on the pan, and released the jaws. The trap snapped shut. The muskrat was caught. The creature stood, looked down at the set trap, and adjusted the chain so that the caught animal would remain visible above the waterline for easy collection. It had baited our trap with a live animal, positioned for our convenience. Pelletier said he watched this from 60 yards through his rifle sights, and his hands did not shake, and he did not fire, and he could not explain why he did not fire, except that what he was seeing was not an attack and was not a threat, and was, in every observable detail, an act of maintenance. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen, because he understood tools, and he understood traps, and he understood animal husbandry, and what he was watching was a thing that understood all three. The creature turned and looked in Pelletier's direction. He said the yellow eyes found him across 60 yards of dark water and held him for approximately 3 seconds. Then it turned away and walked back into the deeper channel and sank beneath the surface without a splash. And the water closed over the place where it had been, and the frogs did not stop calling, and the insects did not stop buzzing, and the basin did not react at all, because the basin already knew what lived in it. Pelletier told this to the full crew, sitting by the fire on the cheniere, with his rifle still across his knees. Hébert listened with his arms folded. Thibodeau listened with his hands on the ground beside him. Boudreau listened with his mouth open. LeBlanc listened and then asked how many pelts the western line had produced that day, and Pelletier looked at him and said nothing. I will tell you now what my mother told me, because this is the point where her words stopped being superstition and became the most accurate description of the basin I have ever heard. Marie-Rose Landry, who had been the traiteur of Montegut for 39 years, who had treated wounds and fevers and births and deaths, and who had never once been wrong about the things she warned against, told me this when I was 24 years old, the first time I announced I was going to the basin south of Bayou du Large. She sat me down in her kitchen in Montegut, and she spoke without stopping, and I'm going to give you her words as closely as I can reconstruct them from a memory that has been holding them for more than 50 years. There are basins in the lower parishes that give too much. The traiteurs have known this since before the Acadians came. The Houma knew it before us. A basin that gives too much is not generous. A basin that gives too much is feeding you. You go in, and the water is full of animals, and the traps are heavy, and the pelts are prime, and you think you have found something good, and you stay, because a man who works for his living does not walk away from a good season. And that is how it keeps you. The yields are the pasture. You are the cattle. The thing that lives in the basin is older than the Acadians, older than the Houma, older than the words we use to describe it. It does not hunt the way a panther hunts or the way an alligator hunts. It raises the game, and it raises the men who come for the game, and when it is hungry, it takes what it has raised. The good years are the bait. The good years are always the bait. The women know this. The traiteurs know this. The men do not know this, because the men do not listen, because the yields are good and the pelts are prime, and a man who works for his living does not walk away from a good season. Augustin, listen to me. Do not go where the land gives too much. I went anyway. I went 3 times. On the 3rd time, the season was the best any crew from Montegut had ever recorded, and I was proud of it. And 4 men who went in with me did not come back out. Hébert, after Pelletier's account, said that what Pelletier had seen was a black bear displaying unusual foraging behavior. He said he had heard of bears manipulating simple objects. He said the firelight was playing on Pelletier's fatigue. He said we had a job to do, and we would do it. Pelletier did not argue. He looked at me. I looked at the fire. Rougarou was shaking. On the morning of November the 10th, Rougarou found a deer carcass. It was hanging from a cypress limb at the edge of camp, approximately 7 feet off the ground. Gutted cleanly through the belly with a single vertical cut, drained of blood, and positioned so that the body cavity was open to the air for drying. The cuts were precise. The hide had not been torn. The offal had been removed and buried. Thibodeau found the burial pit approximately 15 feet from the hanging point, covered with palmetto fronds. The deer was a doe, roughly 110 pounds, fresh killed within the last 6 to 8 hours, in my estimation. No one in camp had killed a deer. No one in camp had heard a deer killed. No one in camp had heard anything move through the cheniere during the night. Pelletier examined the carcass for approximately 10 minutes. He examined the cut. He examined the hanging method. The carcass was suspended from the limb by a strip of green cypress bark twisted into a rope and tied with a knot that Pelletier said was not a knot any trapper uses, but was mechanically sound, and it held the full weight of the animal through the night. He examined the burial pit. He came back to the fire, and he said 3 words. It is feeding us. Hébert said a panther had cached a kill in our camp by coincidence. Thibodeau said nothing. LeBlanc took his skinning knife and began to butcher the deer. Rougarou would not eat it. I ate it. It was fresh and clean and good. And I ate it. And I have thought about that for 51 years. On the night of November the 11th, the 8th day in the Basin, the creature took Jean-Pierre LeBlanc from the Pirogue, and I watched it happen from approximately 6 feet away. And Pelletier watched it happen from the bank at a distance of roughly 40 yards, through the sights of his Winchester, and he did not fire. And I will tell you why he did not fire, and I will tell you what we saw. And there are parts of what I saw that I have never told anyone, and will not tell here. LeBlanc and I had gone out at dusk to check the northern line. This was LeBlanc's line, his most productive run, the one that had been yielding roughly 20 pelts a day, the one that had made him talk about paying off his house lot. The evening was cool, I estimate 52 degrees, and overcast, with no moon and no stars, and a heavy, wet darkness that began settling on the water at approximately 5 in the afternoon. We were in LeBlanc's pirogue, the larger of our 3 boats, with LeBlanc in the bow and myself in the stern, poling. We had a lantern mounted on a cypress pole wedged between the ribs of the hull, and its light reached approximately 20 feet in any direction before the darkness ate it. At the 6th trap on the northern line, in a stretch of open water between 2 cypress stands, approximately 400 yards from camp, LeBlanc leaned over the gunwale to check the set. The trap had taken a large nutria. LeBlanc reached into the water to retrieve the animal. The water beside the pirogue moved. I do not mean rippled. I do not mean splashed. I mean the water displaced laterally, as if something beneath the surface had shifted its weight, and the displacement was large enough to rock the pirogue and push the bow approximately 2 feet to port. LeBlanc pulled his hands out of the water. The lantern swung on its pole, and the light moved across the surface, and I saw, in the moving light, a shape in the water beside the boat that was not a log, and was not a stump, and was not the bottom. It was close. It was approximately 4 feet from the gunwale. It was submerged to what I estimate was a depth of 2 feet. and it was longer than the pirogue, which was 14 feet, and it was dark, and it was not moving, and I could see the outline of what I am forced to describe as shoulders. LeBlanc saw it at the same moment I did. He turned toward me. His mouth opened. He did not speak. The thing rose. It rose from the water beside the pirogue the way a man stands up from a bathtub, pushing upward with its legs, water streaming off its body, its shoulders clearing the surface first, and then its chest, and then its arms. And the water fell off it in sheets, and the sound of it was like a net full of fish being hauled over a gunwale, a heavy, wet, living sound, and it kept rising, and it was tall, and the lantern light hit its body, and I saw it. I saw the fur, dark, almost black, matted and heavy with water, draped with strands of Spanish moss that hung from its shoulders and arms like vestments. I saw the chest broad, deep, wrapped in muscle that moved under the wet fur, the way a horse's flank moves when it breathes. I saw the arms long, longer than a man's arms by what I estimate was 1.5 feet, with hands that had 4 fingers and a thumb and claws that caught the lantern light and held it. I saw the ribs. I saw the ribs. The creature was starving. The ribs were visible through the fur on both sides of its torso, pressed outward against the skin like the staves of a barrel with the hoops loosened. Each one distinct, each one countable. I could see the architecture of its chest cavity the way you can see the frame of a house before the walls go up. It was enormous, and it was wasted, and it was the most terrible combination I have ever seen in a living thing, because size without health is not strength. It is desperation. Its head was above me. I was sitting in the stern of the pirogue, and its head was approximately 4 feet above mine, and the muzzle was long, and the jaw was heavy, and the ears were high, and the eyes were yellow, and the eyes were looking at LeBlanc. Not at me, at LeBlanc. It reached down with one hand, and it took LeBlanc by the chest, not by the collar, not by the arm, by the chest, the way you would pick up a child, with the fingers wrapped around the torso and the thumb braced against the sternum, and it lifted him out of the pirogue. LeBlanc weighed approximately 190 pounds. The creature lifted him the way I would lift a muskrat from a trap. One hand, no effort. The pirogue rocked hard to starboard as LeBlanc's weight left the bow, and I grabbed the gunwale to keep from capsizing, and the lantern swung, and the light swept across the creature's body, and I saw its other hand hanging at its side, open, empty, and I saw that the hand was trembling. LeBlanc did not scream. I will not describe his face. I will say that he looked at me, and I looked at him, and the distance between us was approximately 6 feet, and the creature was holding him at the height of its chest, and I could have reached out and touched LeBlanc's boot, and I did not move. Pelletier was on the bank. He had been setting a supplemental line on the northern shelf, approximately 40 yards east, and he had heard the displacement, and had come to the waterline with his Winchester shouldered and his sights on the creature's center mass. He told me later, and I will give you his words exactly as he gave them to me, that he had a clean shot. The range was manageable. The target was stationary. His hands were steady. He said he did not fire because the creature was not killing LeBlanc. He said it was holding him. He said it held LeBlanc against its chest with one hand the way you hold a man who is hurt, supporting the weight, controlling the position, keeping the body stable, and not the way you hold something you intend to kill. He said he watched for what he estimated was 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, the creature looked down at LeBlanc's face, and then it looked across the water at Pelletier, and the yellow eyes found him, and it looked at him, and then it turned and carried LeBlanc into the cypress, and the dark closed over both of them, and the sound of the water moving against the creature's legs faded within approximately 10 seconds, and then there was nothing. Pelletier said, "It looked at me the way a man looks at another man across a fence. It knew I was there. It knew I had a rifle. It was not afraid." Pelletier said, "It carried him the way you carry a man who is hurt, not the way you carry something you have killed." Pelletier said. It took the one who had produced the most. The pirogue drifted. The lantern light steadied. The frogs continued calling. The basin did not react. LeBlanc was gone. I sat in the stern of the pirogue with my hands on the gunwale, and I did not move for what I estimate was 2 full minutes. Then I heard Pelletier's voice from the bank, clear, steady, controlled, and he said, "Landry, bring the boat in." I poled to the bank. Pelletier stepped into the pirogue. He did not shoulder his rifle. He laid it across the ribs of the hull, and he sat down, and he put his face in his hands. And that was the only time in the years I knew him that I saw Émile Pelletier show anything less than complete professional composure. And it lasted approximately 5 seconds. And then he raised his head and said, "We go back to camp, now." We went back to camp. We told them. A bear did not say it was a bear. On the morning of November the 12th, no one checked the trap lines. We sat on the cheniere in a group 5 men now, where 6 had been, and we did not work. And a bear did not give orders. And the drying shed was full of pelts that no one touched. And the basin was quiet and full and alive around us, the way it had been every morning since we arrived. And the frogs called and the insects buzzed and the water moved against the cypress knees. And LeBlanc's bedroll was still laid out in its place, and his coffee cup was still sitting on the flat stone beside the fire ring. And I looked at these things, and I understood that we were not in the place I had believed we were in. At approximately 9 in the morning, Pelletier unfolded his oilcloth map on the ground beside the fire and called me over. He had been adding to it since we arrived. The X marks, the annotations, the notations I could not read. And now he spread it flat and weighted the corners with stones, and he talked me through what he had been recording. The X marks were locations where game trails had been channeled, artificially straightened and directed toward our trap lines. He had marked 19 of them across the 4 lines. He drew his finger along the pattern, and I could see it. The X marks formed funnels. Each trap line was at the narrow end of a funnel of channeled game trails that drew animals from the wider basin toward the sets. The animals were not finding our traps by chance. They were being driven to them. He pointed to a series of small circles he had drawn near the deeper channels in the southern and western portions of the basin. These were locations where he had noted current anomalies, water moving in directions it should not have been moving in a sealed system. He said the displacement patterns were consistent with something large moving through the deeper water on a regular circuit of patrol, he said, or a route. He had noted the times. The displacements occurred primarily between 2 and 5 in the morning, and again between 4 and 7 in the evening. The creature was on a schedule. He pointed to a cluster of hash marks near the northern line, LeBlanc's line, the most productive line. The hash marks represented the daily yield counts Pelletier had been recording alongside the production numbers. They were not just high, they were accelerating. The northern line had produced 12 pelts on the first day, 17 on the second, 20 on the third, 22 on the fourth. The game was not merely present. The game was being concentrated toward LeBlanc's line at an increasing rate. Pelletier said, "It was fattening his line." He said it quietly, the way a man says something he has verified and does not want to be true. He said the creature had been driving game muskrat, nutria, otter toward the northern line specifically, increasing the concentration daily, keeping LeBlanc's production the highest in the crew, keeping LeBlanc in the basin, keeping LeBlanc committed to the work that was keeping him in range. I said, "LeBlanc talked about paying off his house lot." Pelletier said, "That's the bait. The good season is the bait. Your mother said it. The yields keep the men in the basin. The men who produce the most stay the longest. The men who stay the longest are the easiest to take." I looked at the oilcloth map, and I saw my mother's kitchen in Montegut, and I heard her voice, and I understood that every word she had said was a precise, technical description of a predation system that had been operating in this basin for longer than the Acadians had been in Louisiana. The yields were the pasture. The reset traps were equipment maintenance. The moved trap in the Tupelo break was optimization. The provisioned deer was supplemental feeding. Keeping the men healthy, keeping the men strong, keeping the men in condition. The sound displacement our voices carried across the basin and replayed from the wrong direction was surveillance. It had been listening to our route discussions and pre-positioning game based on where we said we would go. My mother had called the creature old. Pelletier had said the word was wrong. He said, "I don't think old is the right word. I think the right word is experienced." He was right. The creature was not operating on instinct. Instinct does not reset traps. Instinct does not move equipment to better positions. Instinct does not bait trap lines with live animals positioned for convenient human collection. Instinct does not provision a camp with a gutted, dressed, and hung deer carcass. Instinct does not drive game toward a specific man's line to inflate his personal yield and keep him invested in the work. This was method. This was a system developed over a span of time I cannot estimate, refined through repetition, and applied to us with a precision that our own professional trapping operation could not have matched. There are parts of this I have never told anyone and will not tell here. I will say that Pelletier and I sat with that map for approximately 2 hours, and that by the end of those 2 hours we had reconstructed, between his field observations and my mother's oral tradition, a description of a predation cycle that was, in every meaningful sense, a ranching operation. The creature maintained the basin's animal population as a resource not for its own consumption, but as bait. It channeled game toward human trap lines to inflate yields. It maintained the human equipment to sustain production. It supplemented the human food supply to prevent early departure. It monitored the human's operational discussions through acoustic manipulation. And when its own caloric need became acute, when its body had burned through its reserves and the ribs pressed against the skin and the hands trembled, it harvested the most productive human. Because the most productive human was the one who had been in the basin the longest. And the one in the basin the longest was the one most committed to staying. And the one most committed to staying was the easiest to take. This was not territory. This was not a boundary. This was agriculture. We were the crop. Pelletier folded his map. He put it inside his shirt. He looked at me and he said, "We have to tell them." We told them. Hébert listened. Thibodeau listened. Boudreau had been crying since dawn, and he did not stop. Hébert said, "We leave at first light tomorrow." Pelletier said, "We leave now." Hébert said we could not load the pelts and break camp in the dark. Pelletier said, "Leave the pelts." Hébert looked at him as if he had said something in a language he did not understand. Pelletier said, "Henri, the pelts are the bait. If we take them, we are still in the system. Leave them." Hébert looked at the drying shed, approximately 160 pelts, worth roughly $320 at Huma prices, the best yield any crew from Montegut had ever produced. He said, "We leave at first light. We take the pelts." Pelletier did not argue. He looked at me. I did not argue either. $320 was more than most men in Montegut earned in a year. We were still, even then, inside the system. The bait was still working. That night, the night of November the 12th, Thibodeau disappeared. There are parts of this I will not tell in full. I will say that he went to the water's edge at approximately midnight, and that he did not cry out, and that Boudreau, who was on watch, saw a shape at the tree line that was tall and dark and still, and that Thibodeau walked toward it, and that Boudreau did not see what happened next because Boudreau turned away, and that in the morning Thibodeau's bedroll was empty and his boots were placed neatly side by side at the water line, and the water was still, and the frogs were calling. On the morning of November the 13th, the 10th day, and the last day, I woke to the sound of Pelletier's voice saying my name, and his voice was not steady, and that fact alone brought me fully awake before I opened my eyes. Because in all the time I had known Émile Pelletier, I had never heard his voice waver. I opened my eyes. The dawn was gray, overcast, cool, approximately 48 degrees, with a light fog on the water that had not yet burned off. The fire was dead. Boudreaux was sitting upright in his bedroll, with his knees drawn to his chest and his arms wrapped around them, and he was not moving. Hébert was standing at the edge of the drying shed, with his rifle in his hands and his mouth open. The drying shed had been reorganized. Every pelt we had taken, 163 pelts, by my last count, had been removed from the stretching boards, sorted by species, and stacked in neat bundles at the center of the shed. The bundles were organized: muskrat, nutria, otter, mink, raccoon. Each bundle was tied with strips of cypress bark, identical to the bark rope that had suspended the deer carcass. The stretching boards had been cleaned, stacked, and placed beside the bundles. The skinning knives had been wiped and arranged in a row on a flat piece of cypress bark. Outside the shed, the 3 pirogues had been pulled from their mooring points on the cheniere and repositioned at the water's edge in a line, bows facing north toward the channel mouth, toward the exit. Our provisions had been placed in the lead pirogue, the remaining rice, the salt pork, the coffee, the cornmeal. Yes, I'm continuing now. I was mid-sentence in Chapter 8, picking up exactly where I left off. Beside the provisions, placed carefully on a folded piece of canvas, was fresh meat: 2 dressed rabbits and a section of venison, butchered cleanly, drained, and wrapped in palmetto fronds. We had not killed these animals. No one in camp had left the cheniere during the night. The meat was fresh killed within the last 4 to 6 hours, in my estimation. Something had packed us out. I will say that again because I need you to understand the precision of what I am describing. Something had entered our camp during the night, while 5 men slept or did not sleep, in Boudreaux's case, and had sorted our entire season's production by species, cleaned and organized our equipment, repositioned our boats for departure, replenished our provisions with fresh game, and arranged everything with the care and efficiency of a camp manager closing out a season. It had done this without waking any man, except Boudreaux, who had been on watch and who told me later, in a voice I will not attempt to reproduce, that he had seen a shape moving through the camp in the dark, large, upright, slow, deliberate, and that he had watched it work, and that he had not raised his rifle, and that it had moved around him the way you walk around a piece of furniture, and that it had not looked at him. Pelletier was standing beside the lead pirogue. He was looking at the provisions, at the fresh meat, at the pirogues pointed north. His oilcloth map was in his hand. I walked to him, and I stood beside him, and I looked at what he was looking at. He said, "It's finished with us." I said, "What?" He said 5 words. "These are the 5 words I told you I would carry to my grave. And I have carried them. And I am setting them down now, because I am dying, and they should not die with me." He said, "The season is over. Ours." He did not mean our trapping season. He meant the creature's season, its harvest. It had taken what it needed 2 men, LeBlanc and Thibodeau, the 2 highest producers in the crew, and it was finished. And it was sending the rest of us home with our pelts and our provisions and our lives. And the pirogues were pointed at the exit. And the meaning was as clear as any language I have ever been addressed in. "Go. You are done. I have what I came for." Hébert said, "We take the pelts." Pelletier said, "Leave them, Henri." Hébert said, "Those pelts are worth $300. Pelletier said, "Those pelts are its receipt. It kept us in the basin long enough to take 2 men. The pelts are how it did it. If you take them, you will come back next year, because the money will be good, and you will remember how good, and you will bring another crew, and it will do this again." Hébert took the pelts. He loaded them into the pirogues himself, bundle by bundle, and Pelletier watched him do it, and said nothing more. Pelletier would not get into the pirogue. I have described Pelletier as a man of extraordinary observational discipline, and I have told you that he did not guess and did not speculate. And I have told you that he was the finest tracker I ever worked beside. What I have not told you is that Pelletier was, at his core, a man who needed to understand the things he saw. It was not curiosity. It was not recklessness. It was the same quality that had made him mark 19 X's on an oilcloth map and track current anomalies and record daily yield accelerations. A compulsion toward complete observation that was inseparable from his competence. He could not leave an incomplete data set. He could not walk away from a system he had only partially mapped. He stood at the waterline, and he looked south into the basin, and he said, "I want to stay." He did not mean he wanted to die. He did not mean he was unafraid. He meant that he had encountered the most sophisticated predation system he had ever observed. And every fiber of his professional training was pulling him deeper into the basin, toward fuller understanding, toward the complete picture. He wanted to watch it. He wanted to map its full circuit. He wanted to see where it slept and what it ate when it was not eating men, and how it channeled game, and how it manipulated acoustics, and how old it was, and how long it had been operating, and whether there were others. He was standing at the edge of the greatest natural history observation of his life, and I was asking him to turn his back on it. I took him by the arm. He did not resist, but he did not help. I pulled him to the pirogue, and he stepped in, and he sat down, and he picked up his push-pole, and he looked back at the basin one more time, and I saw his face, and his face was the face of a man leaving something he would never see again, and knew it. I have thought about this for 51 years. Pelletier's desire to stay was the bait working at its highest level, not on greed, not on money, not on the pelts, but on the very quality that made him the most valuable observer in the crew. His competence was the trap. His need to understand was the lure. The creature had built a system so intricate that the act of comprehending the system was itself a reason to remain inside it. My mother had said the yields keep the men in the basin. She was right. But the yields are not only pelts. For a man like Pelletier, the yield was the system itself, the most fascinating thing he had ever seen, offered at the price of his life. I pulled him out. I do not know if that was mercy or theft. We pulled north. 4 men in 2 pirogues, Hebert and Boudreau in the lead, Pelletier and myself behind. The pirogues were heavy with pelts. The channel was narrow. The cypress canopy closed over us, and the light was green-brown, and the water was still, and we did not speak, and the basin was quiet around us, and the frogs called, and the insects buzzed, and nothing followed us, and nothing blocked our path. The channel mouth opened ahead of us, and the light of the open marsh came through the trees, and we passed through, and we were out. The basin let us go. I will not describe the return to Montegut. I will not describe LeBlanc's wife. I will not describe Thibodeau's family. There are things I have carried for 51 years that I will carry to the end, because setting them down would not lighten them. It would only place them on someone else. And the people they would fall on have carried enough. Hebert sold the pelts in Houma on November the 17th, 1899. He received $318, the largest single crew payment the Houma fur broker had recorded that season. He divided the money 4 ways. He gave LeBlanc's share to LeBlanc's wife. He gave Thibodeau's share to Thibodeau's family. This was the correct and decent thing to do. And Hebert was a correct and decent man. And he did it. And then he organized a crew for the following autumn and went back to the basin. I did not go. Pelletier did not go. Boudreau left Terrebonne Parish entirely and moved to Assumption Parish and did not trap again. Hebert's 1900 crew was 5 men. They came back with the best yields in the parish. They were all present. No one was taken. Hebert went back in 1901 with 6 men. They came back with yields that exceeded 1900. All present. Hebert went back in 1902. In the autumn of 1902, Hebert's crew was 7 men. 6 came back. The seventh, a young trapper from Dulac named Saunier, was listed in the Terrebonne Parish records as having left the crew early due to illness and returned to Dulac independently. I knew Saunier's family. He did not return to Dulac. His body was never recovered. The parish record was not corrected because Hebert filed the crew manifest, and Hebert listed 6 departures and 6 returns. And no one in the parish clerk's office checked the original entry count. And the arithmetic was never questioned. The Basin gave too much that year. It gave too much the year before. It has given too much every year since, as far as I'm aware. And the crews keep going back. And the yields keep being extraordinary. And every few years a man does not come home, and the record says he left early or moved away, or was not on the original manifest. And no one checks, because the pelts are good, and the money is good. And a man who works for his living does not walk away from a good season. I have kept my silence for 51 years. I have kept it because telling the truth would accomplish one of 2 things, and I cannot accept either. If they called me a liar, the Basin would keep producing and the men would keep going in blind, which is what is already happening. If they believed me, they would go in armed, and they would try to kill it. And I saw its ribs. I saw its ribs pressed against its skin like the staves of a barrel with the hoops loosened. It was starving. It was the last of whatever it is. And I do not know what a starving thing does when you corner it. And I do not know what happens to the Basin's ecology if you remove the thing that has been managing it for longer than my family has been in Louisiana. And I do not know if killing it would be justice, or if it would be the same kind of ignorance that put us in the Basin in the first place, the assumption that because we can take something, we should. My mother died in 1924. She did not ask me about the Basin. She did not ask me if she had been right. She knew she had been right. On the day she died, she took my hand and she said, "The ones who come back are the ones it didn't need yet." I have thought about that word, yet every day since. Pelletier died in 1932 in his house in Dulac of pneumonia. He was 71. I went to Dulac for the burial, and afterward his daughter gave me a box of his personal effects. And inside the box, folded into quarters and stained with water and age, was the oilcloth map. The trap line map of the Basin south of Bayou du Large, with the 4 lines drawn in, and the X marks at the channeled game trails, and the circles at the current anomalies, and the hash marks tracking LeBlanc's accelerating yields. I unfolded it on Pelletier's kitchen table, and I looked at it for a long time. Beside one of the X marks, the one nearest the northern line, LeBlanc's line, the most productive line, Pelletier had written a single word in pencil. The pencil was faint. The word was small. I had to hold the map to the window light to read it. The word was élevage. It is the French word for livestock farming. Pelletier had understood the entire system and compressed it into a single word, and he had written it on a map that no one was meant to see, and he had said nothing, and he had died with the map in a box in his house, and the word had waited there for me to find it, and I found it, and I understood it, and I have carried it for 18 years, and now I'm giving it to you. I said at the beginning that Pelletier looked at the Pirogues on that last morning and said 5 words. The season is over, ours. What I did not tell you then, what I have saved for the end, because it is the thing that changed the meaning of everything, is what he said next. He looked at the Basin, and then he looked at me, and he said, "It will need to eat again." 6 men went into the Basin in November of 1899, and 2 of us came back, and I have told you why, and I have told you how, and I have told you what my mother knew, and what Pelletier mapped, and what the creature built, and what it took and what it returned. The Basin south of Bayou du Large is still there. The yields this season, I am told, are the best in years. The pasture is still producing.